Our AQA predicted papers are here and they are as before based on detailed analysis of past trends, recurring question types and examiner reports. Obviously, while we can't say exactly what will come up, we've used every bit of insight available to make the best possible predictions. This means that you can spend your revision time focusing on the topics that really matter. Each predicted paper includes exam style questions covering key topics, complete with mark schemes that show you exactly how to structure your answers and earn top marks. For 2025, we've also introduced free video walkthroughs, which are led by experienced teachers and are designed to break down each question, show you how to plan your responses, and explain how to include key historical evidence in a way that examiners reward. You'll also find timed practice opportunities to really help you get used to real exam conditions. And of course, importantly, they help you spot any gaps in your knowledge before the real exam. So, as you prepare, of course, don't forget to look after yourself. Exams can be really stressful, but you are, of course, more than your grades. So, take regular breaks, stay hydrated, and look after yourself. Now, without further ado, let's get into our paper 1 topics. Now, be sure to use the timestamps to skip to the areas relevant to you, and of course, check that we provide your topic using the timestamps as well. So we're going to start with Germany, 1890 to 1945, democracy and dictatorship. Again, these are based on our analysis of previous years, but it's important to revise the full specification just to make sure you're really prepared for anything that could appear. Now, one predicted topic is life for women in Nazi Germany. The Nazi regime promoted an ideal image of women that focused on them being homemakers and mothers rather than workers. Women were encouraged to follow the so-called 3Ks, Kinder for children, Küche for kitchen, and Kirche for church. The regime introduced policies to support this image, such as the law for the encouragement of marriage in 1933, which gave loans to newlyweds that were reduced if they had children. The Mother's Cross was awarded to women who had many children, with gold given for 8 or more. The Lebensborn programme was also introduced, which encouraged women to have children with SS officers as well. Women were actively discouraged from working, especially in professional roles. In 1936, they were banned from becoming judges or civil servants. Girls' education was focused on domestic skills rather than academic or career-based learning. However, despite the regime's ideals, these policies often contradicted reality. From 1939 onwards, the war effort meant that more women were needed in the workforce, and many returned to jobs the Nazis had previously tried to steer them away from. Now, another key area is the problems facing the Nazi Party between 1923 and 1929. The Munich Putsch in 1923 was Hitler's failed attempt to seize power in Bavaria. Although it was a short-term failure that led to his arrest and the banning of the Nazi Party, it gave Hitler significant publicity and forced him to rethink his strategy. During his time in prison, he wrote Mein Kampf, which outlined key Nazi beliefs. After this point, the party focused on gaining power through elections instead of violence. This period also saw serious economic and political challenges. Hyperinflation in 1923 wiped out people's savings and created deep resentment towards the Weimar government. The years from 1924 to 1929 are often called the golden years under Gustav Stresemann, as Germany began to recover, but this made it harder for the Nazis to gain support during that time. You also need to be familiar with life in Germany under Kaiser Wilhelm II. The Kaiser was focused on turning Germany into a world power through a policy called Weltpolitik, which emphasized military and naval expansion. During his rule, Germany became a world leader in industrial production, especially in steel and chemicals. However, this rapid industrial growth caused tension. Many workers joined trade unions and the socialist movement, demanding better working conditions and more rights. The political system allowed for a parliament, the Reichstag, but it had limited power. The Kaiser retained control over the military and foreign policy. Okay, next here, another important area is the methods used to establish a dictatorship between 1933 and 34. Following the Reichstag fire in February 1933, the Nazis blamed a Dutch communist, Van der Lubbe, and used the incident as an excuse to target communists. The Reichstag fire decree allowed the regime to suspend civil liberties and arrest political opponents without trial. In the March 1933 election, the Nazis won 44% of the vote. Although this wasn't a majority, they used their position to pass the Enabling Act later that month. which gave Hitler the power to pass laws without the Reichstag for 4 years, effectively ending democracy. Now, our final predicted topic here is the Night of the Long Knives in June 1934, which saw Hitler order the murder of SA leaders, including Ernst Röhm, as well as other political rivals. This eliminated threats from within his own party and gained him the support of the German army. When President Hindenburg died in August 1934, Hitler combined the roles of Chancellor and President, declaring himself Führer. The army then swore an oath of loyalty directly to him, securing his total control over Germany. Okay, let's now move on to America 1920 to 1973, Opportunity and Inequality. These are based on past trends and previous exam content, but you should revise the full course to ensure that you're ready for anything that comes up. Now, one focus is interpretations of President John F. Kennedy. Kennedy is often remembered positively as a young, charismatic leader who supported civil rights and helped defuse the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, avoiding nuclear war. His New Frontier policies aim to tackle poverty and improve education. However, there are also criticisms. His progress on civil rights was slow, and many key changes only happened after his assassination. His foreign policy record is mixed, with failures like the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, and his involvement in Vietnam laid the groundwork for greater escalation later on. Historians offer different interpretations of Kennedy. Some view him as a heroic leader who inspired progress, while others argue he was overrated and that his image has been enhanced by his tragic death rather than his political achievements. Another key topic is the problems faced by President Roosevelt in helping America recover from the Great Depression. When he took office in 1933, unemployment stood at 25% and the banking system had collapsed, leaving people without savings and businesses without loans. On top of this, a major drought known as the Dust Bowl hit agriculture, worsening the crisis. Roosevelt also faced political opposition. Republicans believed his New Deal gave the federal government too much power. The Supreme Court declared some of his laws unconstitutional, and radical critics like Huey Long argued he wasn't going far enough to help the poor. Roosevelt responded with several key strategies. His fireside chats on the radio helped rebuild public trust. His New Deal introduced job creation schemes, Social Security, and bank reforms. By 1935, he launched the Second New Deal, which placed even greater emphasis on workers' rights and support for struggling communities. Okay, next here we suggest looking into the experience of African Americans in the 1920s. This was a time of widespread racism and enforced segregation, especially in the southern United States. The Jim Crow laws legally enforced the separation of black and white Americans in public spaces, such as schools, transport, and restaurants. Black Americans also faced systemic discrimination in employment, housing, and access to voting, often being prevented from registering to vote through unfair tests and intimidation. During this time, the KKK grew in power. It was a white supremacist group that used fear, threats, and violence to spread racist ideas and suppress black communities. Despite the hostility in the South, many African Americans saw better opportunities elsewhere. Between 1916 and the 1930s, large numbers took part in what became known as the Great Migration. They moved to northern cities like Chicago and New York in search of better jobs, higher wages, and greater freedom. In these urban areas, black culture flourished, particularly during the Harlem Renaissance, a cultural movement in which black artists, musicians, and writers gained recognition and fame. Figures like Langston Hughes emerged as influential voices in American culture. However, real legal and political progress for African Americans was limited during this period. Civil rights groups such as the NAACP worked tirelessly to fight discrimination and challenge unjust laws, but with little success in changing legislation at the time. For most African Americans, racism and segregation remained part of daily life throughout the 1920s. Now, finally, here, another important topic to revise is the economic, social, and cultural changes that took place in America during the 50s. Following the Second World War, the United States experienced a period of strong economic growth. There were more jobs available, wages increased, and many families joined the growing middle class. A new trend known as suburbanization emerged, with many people leaving cities to live in newly built suburban neighborhoods. Alongside this economic boom, American consumer culture began to flourish. There was a significant increase in advertising and the availability of credit, making it easier for people to buy goods like televisions, cars, and refrigerators. Shopping malls and fast food restaurants also began to grow in popularity, shaping modern American life. Culturally, the 1950s saw major changes. Rock and roll music, led by figures like Elvis Presley, became hugely popular, especially among young people, and challenged more traditional values. Teenagers developed their own identity with more freedom, disposable income, and growing influence on fashion and music. This marked the beginning of a distinct youth culture in America. Despite these developments, inequality remained a major issue, though. Although many women had taken on important jobs during the war years, they were now being encouraged to return to domestic roles as housewives. At the same time, racial segregation was still widespread, particularly in the South. The civil rights movement began to attract attention in the 50s, setting the stage for the major protests and legal battles of the following decades. Okay, we hope these are useful to guide your revision. Next up, we're looking at conflict and tension, the interwar years 1918 to 39. Again, the following areas are predicted to feature on the 2025 GCSE paper. While these predictions can help focus your revision, it's important, I keep saying it, to revise the entire course content to be fully prepared. Now, one significant area to understand is America's absence from the League of Nations. After the First World War, many Americans supported a policy of isolationism, meaning they wanted to avoid becoming involved in European conflicts. Although President Woodrow Wilson was one of the key figures behind the idea of the League, the US Congress refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles and blocked America's membership. They were concerned that joining the League could lead to more involvement in foreign wars and would place a financial burden on the United States. America's decision not to join had serious consequences. The League of Nations was weaker without the economic and military strength of the USA. Sanctions imposed by the League were often ineffective, as aggressive countries could still trade with the United States. Without American involvement, the League lacked credibility, and dictators such as Hitler in Germany and militarists in Japan felt more confident breaking international agreements without serious consequences. Another key topic is the aims of the peacemakers in 1919 following the end of the First World War. The three main leaders at the Paris Peace Conference were known as the Big Three. President Woodrow Wilson of the United States wanted a fair and lasting peace, promoting ideas such as self determination for nations and the creation of the League of Nations. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George wanted to punish Germany, but not so harshly that it would become weak and unable to trade. He also had to consider the British public, who demanded tough treatment. Meanwhile, French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau wanted revenge for the devastation caused to France during the war. He pushed for heavy reparations and the weakening of Germany to prevent future attacks. These competing aims led to conflicts between the leaders. Wilson and Clemenceau clashed repeatedly. Wilson aimed for peace and fairness, while Clemenceau demanded strict punishment. Lloyd George found himself trying to balance both views. In the end, the Treaty of Versailles was a compromise that pleased no one entirely. France was satisfied by the harsh terms, but Germany's resentment grew. Wilson's League of Nations was created, but without American participation. Lloyd George feared the treaty would lead to future conflict, and just 2 decades later, it did. One of the most important challenges to the League's authority was the Manchurian crisis in the early 30s. In 31, Japan invaded the Chinese region of Manchuria, claiming that Chinese soldiers had sabotaged a Japanese railway. In reality, Japan used this as an excuse to seize control of the area, set up a puppet government, and rename it Manchukuo. The League of Nations responded by condemning Japan's actions and launching an investigation. This became known as the Lytton Report, but it took a full year to be completed. When the League finally demanded that Japan withdraw, Japan simply ignored the decision and left the League altogether in 1933. This event was a major failure for the League. It had no army to enforce its decisions, and its sanctions were meaningless, especially because the USA, which was not a League member, continued trading with Japan. The failure in Manchuria showed that the League was powerless against strong nations, and it encouraged other aggressive powers like Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy to test the limits of international law. The final section, likely to appear here, focuses on the causes of the Second World War. Many historians point to the Treaty of Versailles itself as a key factor. Its harsh terms, including the loss of land, heavy reparations, and the war guilt clause, caused deep anger and resentment in Germany. Hitler used this anger to gain support and promised to overturn the treaty and restore Germany's strength. Hitler's foreign policy directly challenged the treaty. He rebuilt Germany's armed forces, which was strictly forbidden. In 1936, he marched troops into the Rhineland, which was meant to remain demilitarized. Britain and France didn't act. In 1938, Hitler carried out the Anschluss, uniting Germany and Austria again without serious resistance. Later that year, he demanded the Sudetenland, a German speaking region of Czechoslovakia. Britain and France responded with appeasement. Appeasement was the policy of allowing Hitler to break the rules of the treaty in the hope that it would prevent another war. At the Munich conference in 1938, they allowed him to take the Sudetenland in return for a promise of no further aggression. However, this only encouraged Hitler to go further, as he saw Britain and France as weak and unwilling to stop him. In August 1939, Hitler shocked the world by signing the Nazi-Soviet pact with Stalin. The two leaders agreed not to attack each other and secretly agreed to divide Poland between them. Just a few weeks later, in September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. This was the final straw for Britain and France, who declared war on Germany. The Second World War had begun. Okay, we hope those were helpful too. We're now going to move on to the final area we've made predictions for, and that is conflict and tension between East and West, 1945 to 72. So, firstly, it's important to understand the causes of tension between the USA and the USSR in the years 45 to 49, the early Cold War period. The roots of the conflict lay in deep ideological differences. The United States was capitalist and democratic, supporting free elections, individual rights, and private enterprise. In contrast, the Soviet Union was a communist dictatorship with state control of the economy and strict censorship. These opposing beliefs made cooperation difficult. At the end of the Second World War, the Yalta and Potsdam conferences in 1945 tried to determine how Europe would be rebuilt. Although both sides agreed to divide Germany, there was disagreement over issues like reparations and the future of Eastern Europe. The USA and USSR increasingly distrusted one another. Between 1945 and 1948, the Soviet Union expanded its influence across Eastern Europe, installing communist governments in countries such as Poland, Hungary, and Romania. This was seen by the West as aggressive and threatening. In response, President Truman announced the Truman Doctrine in 1947, pledging to contain the spread of communism. This was followed by the Marshall Plan in 1948, where the USA offered financial aid to help rebuild European economies and prevent the appeal of communism. Tensions escalated further during the Berlin blockade of 1948-49. Stalin attempted to cut off all supplies to West Berlin in an effort to force the Western Allies out. The USA responded with the Berlin airlift, flying in food, fuel, and other supplies for almost a year. This event showed how committed the USA was to resisting Soviet expansion. It also led to the formation of NATO, a military alliance created in 1949 to defend against future Soviet aggression. This early period cemented the division between East and West. Trust between the USA and USSR broke down completely, and the Cold War rivalry began in earnest. Another key area is the arms race and its effect on the Cold War between 1949 and 61. In 49, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, ending America's monopoly on nuclear power. The USA responded by developing the hydrogen bomb in 1952, which was far more powerful than previous weapons. The USSR quickly followed with their own hydrogen bomb in 1953, intensifying the arms race. Technological competition escalated further in 1957 when the USSR launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. This alarmed the United States as it suggested Soviet superiority in space and missile technology. In response, the USA developed high-altitude U-2 spy planes to keep watch on Soviet military developments. The arms race led to both sides amassing huge arsenals of nuclear weapons. This created a state of mutual deterrence known as MAD, mutually assured destruction, which meant that neither side dared to launch a nuclear attack for fear of total annihilation. The arms race also sparked the space race, culminating in the US moon landing in 1969. The threat of nuclear war became frighteningly real during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which was perhaps the closest the world came to a full scale nuclear conflict. Now, next, another likely topic is the Hungarian Uprising of 1956, a significant moment in Cold War history. Several factors led to the uprising. Hungary was suffering under a harsh communist regime led by Rakosi, which was enforced through secret police, censorship, and a lack of political freedom. At the same time, Soviet economic policies caused widespread poverty and food shortages. Following the death of Stalin in 1953, Khrushchev's de Stalinization campaign gave people hope that Soviet control might ease. Western radio broadcasts encouraged many Hungarians to believe that the USA and its allies would support them if they rebelled. Protests began in October 1956 and reformer Imre Nagy took leadership. Nagy promised sweeping changes, including free elections, a more democratic political system, and withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact. However, this went too far for the Soviet Union. In November, Khrushchev responded with force, sending in tanks to crush the uprising. Thousands were killed, Nagy was captured and executed, and a new pro Soviet leader, Kedar, was installed. The uprising had a lasting impact, and it showed that the USSR would not tolerate any rebellion within its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. The US, despite condemning the Soviet action, did not intervene militarily. This made it clear that the West would not risk direct conflict with the USSR over satellite states. The event also increased Cold War tensions by demonstrating that the Soviet Union was prepared to use force to maintain control and that Western support would be limited to words, not action. Now, lastly, we have the predicted topic of détente, a term used to describe the easing of tensions between the US and the Soviet Union during the 70s. There were several reasons why both sides were motivated to improve relations. The threat of nuclear war became very real after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, and both superpowers recognized the danger of further escalation. Economic issues also played a role. Both nations were spending vast amounts of money on the arms race, which put pressure on their economies. Public pressure, especially in the US, was increasing due to anti war movements and dissatisfaction with involvement in the Vietnam War. Additionally, the growing influence of China meant that both the USA and the USSR were eager to secure diplomatic advantage. One of the major developments of détente was the signing of nuclear arms agreements. The SALT I Treaty in 1972 was a key milestone as it limited the number of certain types of nuclear weapons each side could possess. While détente did help reduce tensions, it did not end Cold War rivalry altogether. Critics in America felt the policy was too soft on communism, while the Soviet Union continued to maintain strict control over Eastern Europe, and the USA continued to support anti communist regimes elsewhere. So, those are all of our predictions for AQA History Paper 1. We really hope they come in useful. Best of luck in your exams.